Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Sem Says podcast. I am your co-host, Alex Brown.
I'm Nikolai Berlinski.
And today we're joined with a good friend of mine, another seminarian, Dominic Mann from the Diocese of Arlington. Dominic, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Now, we invited Dominic here because Dominic has a very interesting hobby. I'm very impressed by it. Dominic, you're into poetry, right?
That's right.
That's awesome. Now, I'm interested in that. I'm going to come right out and say it. I like poetry. I know Nikolai.
Yeah, I've written some stuff, but I've never had anything published per se. Yeah.
But poetry isn't really something you hear about that much. I wasn't really taught about poetry in school. We covered it briefly in Britlit.
Britlit, yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone's heard of Britlit.
Yeah.
Everyone remembers Britlit, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't seem like something I was taught how to do. I wasn't taught the intricacies of poetry. I wasn't really. I don't know. So how'd you get into poetry? Where did this come about?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I definitely can relate for basically my whole life until about maybe 2 years ago. So probably similar to both of you guys, my experience of poetry prior to college was you just memorize a bunch of lines for a poem, like a said poem,
Right.
that people said was really famous and was sort of follow your basic poetry tropes,
Right.
A, B, A, B, whatever. The outlaw went tonight and, he was caught by the men of right, or what, it's
Right.
stuff like that. And then you memorize it and you recite it to your mom. I was homeschooled, so I recited it to my mom and my dad.
Oh, dang, I didn't
That
know
makes
that.
3 of us.
Yeah.
Nice. That was poetry. My experience of that was identical to everything poetry was, as I was growing up. So what was poetry then? It was just kind of like this lame sort of rote thing that you all is required is memorization.
Right.
And that's basically all it is. And if you can write rhymes, then maybe you're a poet. So yeah, so that was basically my definition of poetry and experience of poetry. So then in high school, so I haven't even gotten to college yet. In high school, I was sort of thinking ahead to college. I was like, man, what do I want to study? Where do I want to go? In junior year, I read this great work, which to this day is maybe my favorite work of literature, period. And it was The Ballad of the White Horse by G.K. Chesterton. And I know,
Oh, yep.
Oh, okay. All
let,
right.
me, let me just take a pause from this podcast real quick and say, yes, I recognize that G.K. Chesterton is, so used to the point of a fault by seminarians. So I will intentionally place myself in that category. That said, all right, back to the podcast. Chesterton is phenomenal, and this work is actually objectively great.
Yeah.
I say that subjectively, but
You get
come
no,
on.
no argument here.
Right.
I was commenting the other day that if I get to heaven, God willing, and G.K. Chesterton isn't there, I'm going to doubt that I'm in heaven.
Oh man, yeah, no, that's. I'd still want to be in heaven, but I know he's there. So I read The Ballad of the White Horse. It was hard to read at first, I think, because I didn't know what poetry was. Again, I thought that poetry was just memorizing lines that rhymed. So I read that work, and after a month of laborious study, because I don't even understand what it's about, for the longest time, I finally write a paper on it, and it sort of clicked, and I realized, wow, this is a beautiful work, and it's beautiful in and of itself, but it also there's a beauty to the, I guess, to the poetry itself, to the actual mode in which what is beautiful is expressed. So the meter and the rhyme and the rhythm of the thing. And it was actually then in my junior year of high school that I pretty much decided I want to study literature when I go to college. And that's what happened. So I went to Christendom and I started studying literature. And kind of in the back of my mind, I like G.K. Chesterton and The Ballad of the White Horse. And that's, great. Okay, good. But as far as the rest of poetry, we don't need to worry about that. It's just G.K. Chesterton and The Ballad of the White Horse.
Sure.
And so I was enjoying reading all these novels and historical criticism. And then I get to senior year, and there's this one required class that I had to take my spring semester of senior year called Poetry and Poetics. And just to give you guys an idea, there were people in that class from other majors who were just taking it because this professor was an easy grader. It was
naturally.
That's how much respect people had for this class. Going into it, that's how much respect I had. Now that I look back, that was one of the most formational classes I've ever taken in my life.
Oh, wow.
In an academic setting. This professor, for all the fact that he couldn't get through half of a syllabus in one semester,
Right.
Yeah, naturally, yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as a poetry professor would. And the fact that, his grading style was a bit unconventional, and it was easy to sort of slide by. Regardless of all that, he did have a genius for just poetry, and he really was brilliant regarding that. And he taught it well as a subject matter, but more than that, when he read a poem, when we'd be going over a poem, and he'd have different students in the class read the poem, and then we'd talk about it as we're taking turns reading it, and then he'd say the poem back to us, and there was something different in how he said it that we weren't expressing. And he was entering into all the subtleties that the words could express, and the beauty of the rhythm and everything, even in the simplest 4-line poems to longer works. It was there that my appreciation for poetry really sort of, I guess, happened. Before that, it was just, I like this one work, and now I recognize poetry as this incredible genre and type of art in its own right.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'd say from my experience, kind of similar. You grow up, you learn nursery rhymes, and that's your experience of poetry is the itsy bitsy spider or something like that.
Hickory dickory dock.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and then you grow up a little bit, and then it becomes the memorization phase of, okay, you got to memorize Henry Wadsworth Longfellow or somebody like that, and then it's just boring. You're like, oh, this is some old guy telling some story, or
Longfellow is just the worst case.
or whatever. And then when you become an adult, you're like, wait, poetry is actually awesome. It's got so much there in it. You can express so much without using so many words as a person would use in prose as much, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
I think what you're hitting on is that in poetry, what makes it poetry is the pouring in of something human into it, particularly with rhythm. I'm thinking my favorite poem is The Destruction of Sennacherib by
that's a good one.
Tennyson. But it sounds like horses running. The Assyrian came down like a wolf on a hole, which is something you couldn't... You could say that. You could say horses ran down the hill, but there's something to have a whole story with feeling like you're on the back of a horse.
Right. Yeah.
So it's something you can put into these little intricacies that make it more human, make it more you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I would have put myself in this, I might have ignorantly put myself in this category of Plato came before Aristotle, therefore Plato is wrong. Aristotle came before Thomas Aquinas, but informed Thomas Aquinas, therefore you know where I'm going.
Sure,
but now that I honestly, my study of poetry has sort of helped me to recognize that there are spiritual realities indicated by the things we see in the world and nature. Not to say that dualism is a thing, but if someone with a poetic spirit kind of looks out on the destruction of Sennacherib or the charge of the Light Brigade, there's a tragic beauty in everything that's going on, and reality as it's played out in that moment with man, the tension between men and the tensions between good and evil, and the wills that men have, all of that being played out. It's clear there's more going on here than just guys on horses running at each other. It's those sort of that's kind of hints at what beauty is, but it's also those that spiritual reality that I think poetry sort of reaches for. It's there's a beauty in things, and if we just change our way of talking about things and our way of expressing things, we can almost get at it, through language.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I was going to offer, one of the things that entering seminary really showed to me is how different the Psalms are. That the Psalms are a type of poetry. It's not just, this is a book of the Bible and they're little reflections or something, but they're beautiful poetry. The Psalm for morning prayer that talks about penance, that uses that poetic vision of making me white as snow, or raising up the bones that you have shattered, and it's such a different image instead of just saying, hey, God, I sinned and I'm sorry, and like you're going to forgive me and make it better. But using that poetic vision and that imagery just makes it so much more visceral and from the soul, from the heart. I think that the Psalms have awakened my eyes to an appreciation of poetry in that sense as well. Yeah,
That's a good association.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, I would line for line what you said starting out there. Like, coming to seminary has made me appreciate the Psalms like so much more. They're almost, if not my favorite way to pray, they're like one of my favorite. One of my friends said, like, just put it simply, like the Psalms are just very moving, and it's true for sure. Yeah, you brought up the point of simile or analogy, which our old friend Chesterton talks about actually in a non-poetic work called The Everlasting Man, which I'm re-listening to right now, where he talks about, I think it's The Everlasting Man, where he talks about basically the power of the simile. And like, there are images in nature that like evoke the human spirit higher. So I can say like, God, I'm sorry. And that's just a factually true statement. And I hope God's merciful, that kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. God is merciful. I hope God show me mercy in this moment. Right. But then to like express it in that way sort of like helps you to connect with that factual reality, like emotionally. It unites your whole spirit to it, kind of. Yeah, so definitely similes are, I would argue that poetry like couldn't fully be poetry without similes, for sure.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah. That's like what we were talking about recently, just in a conversation outside of the podcast. We've been discussing the Last Battle by C.S. Lewis and Chronicles of Narnia, and how poetic in its own right is the end where the battle cry is further up, further in. And I can't quote it verbatim, and I know I'm going to get hate mail later from the faithful Catholics who are listening to this.
Yeah, you will.
But there's an idea of the further you go into Narnia, in Aslan's country, the less likely you are to get to the center. Like you just go further in and further in, and you're not getting any closer to the center, because the condition of being a follower of God is to always be going further and further into something. So you're right. Looking at nature, you could say, God, I'm sorry. But you could look at nature and go further in, and then keep going and go further and further and further in. And to say that ever more in the image and likeness of God.
Yeah.
I think it's something poetry can let us do. And all nature does that verily.
Yeah. Yeah, Dr. Haggerty. I don't know if have you guys had Dr. Haggerty?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All the Dr. Haggerty fans out there rejoice. She basically I think she posited, she didn't tell us definitely, but she posited God will always be a mystery even when we get to heaven. So, which kind of indicates that it's like, how could a human being ever know God in his infinite fullness, which kind of gets at what you're saying. And there's the fact that, Aslan is just God,
Right, yeah.
Right, clearly, that's
Spoiler
just,
alert,
right,
yeah.
Exactly, yeah, like, I feel Narnia is like the Bible for, kids or something.
Kids, I read it.
For seminarians.
Yeah.
True. Lexio and Narnia.
Lexio and Narnia.
So to get into some more specific details, do you have, other than Chesterton, any favorite poets, any favorite poems? No? Okay.
I'm kidding.
It's Chesterton all the time, always.
No, I'm kidding. Yeah. Yes. No, who are some of my favorite poets? Well, I really do like the Catholic Literary Revival, like that whole kind of, so Chesterton is right in there. Also guys like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, I actually, for all that he's, put in a kind of a box of total fantasy, like Tolkien's works are actually really beautiful, just as poetry in their own right.
Right.
And like, I love Lord of the Rings. Let me just get that out there.
The Lord of the Rings is a theological work.
I think so. Yeah. Like Tolkien is just the next St. Thomas.
Those are mighty shoes to fill.
Yeah. On either side, actually. But, I really like the poems of Robert Frost. So I guess poetry that there is kind of that, poetry kind of has a nature to it. It's what we've sort of been talking about up to this point, where you can sort of connect with a poetic spirit, that goes across different peoples and all times. Poetry, there's also a subjective side to poetry, and that's kind of how each person responds and the kind of poetry that each person responds to. And I really like poetry that sort of evokes nature. So one of my favorite poems ever is Stopping by Woods in a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. There are a few poems of kind of its sort of minimal size and length and stature that evokes so clearly the images he's trying to bring up, of just like a dark, peaceful, snowy evening and dark woods. So that's an example of one I really like. I guess a deeper reason that I do like that poem is that it evokes like a deeper spiritual reality beyond just the physical nature of what he's saying. So at the end, I don't know if you guys remember the poem. He's just sitting there looking at sitting next to. I always imagine he's on this like little road, and he's on this little horse cart with his horse, and off to he's heading toward the village. Off to the right is this big snowy field, and on the left of the road are the woods, which just go deeper and darker in, and kind of down forward into the valley. You can see the twinkling lights of the village. And right at the end, he's just taking the beauty of this landscape in, and he says, "The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have miles to go before I sleep. I have miles to go before I sleep." And he repeats it, and the indication there is that he has a life to live, and there's death to be met at the end. And I didn't pick up on that till a friend pointed it out, but it's so true. Like, it's kind of a meditation on higher realities than just snow and trees.
Right.
I think that's something that poetry can do.
No, that's awesome.
Makes sense. Yeah. Taking it to a different direction almost, but something I want to highlight.
Sure.
All of the poets we've mentioned so far were all men.
Right.
And again, hate mail's coming.
It is.
But
you're a seminarian, so.
Right. But I don't know. I in my experience have encountered a stigma where poetry seems feminine. But it's yeah. Sorry, I don't know. I don't know. If
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Okay, but when you think about poets, you think, at least what comes to my mind is Chesterton, Tolkien, Lewis, Tennyson. Did I ever say Tennyson? Kipling, Shakespeare, Homer. Like, it's a masculine trait to be poetic, to be able to express yourself, to be as human, to be as clever, to be smart enough to be able to draw on different experiences and to say a lot with a little. To say a lot with a little is a masculine trait, really.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. I guess to say a lot with little, is a masculine trait, and poetry is a masculine trait. But before people start writing their hate mail, like it's not a trait that's specific to men.
Sure.
So it's which I think is what you're saying. Also, I think we're agreeing. It's like a trait that's specific to the human spirit, and men do themselves, or people do themselves a disservice when they cut certain people out of contributions to this part of the human spirit. I feel like maybe there is a little bit of that stigma, but at the same time, let's not kid ourselves. There have been great men who have been great poets,
Right.
and without pulling ourselves the other way, because there are great women who have been great poets. And one of my favorite poems, going back to Nikolai's question, is this poem called Goblin Market, which has a really cool name. And
that sounds awesome.
Right. By Dr. Keats, God bless him, my poetry professor from college, who has, by the way, since passed away, so God rest his soul. He just mentioned this poem offhand, and we're like talking about some kind of poetry or something. And he mentions Christina Rossetti, the poetess, I don't know.
Okay.
Authoress.
Sure.
Authoress, yeah, as the author of, I guess, one work, and then he mentions offhand, and she also wrote Goblin Market, great poem. And immediately my mind was like, Goblin Market, that just sounds cool, like, regardless.
Yeah.
Right.
So I wrote it in my notebook and looked it up later, and it is such a beautiful poem. Like I'd have to write a poem about how beautiful this poem is. Like it's long. It's like it takes 30 minutes to read well.
Okay.
But it tells a story, and about two girls and the dangers of temptation and the reality of true love and sacrifice. So and it's like it literally is one of my favorite poems. Kind of for all the reasons I said I like Stopping by Woods by Robert Frost.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, writing poetry isn't the same as like climbing Mount Everest.
Sure.
And it's not the same as, doing a triathlon. But in a way, it is. What is it in men that makes them do those things? Well, I would argue it's that part of the human spirit that's striving for the ideal. It's striving for the peak of Everest, and it's striving for like the finish line of a triathlon. And I would say that like that is what poetry does. It helps for when it's written. It helps those who experience it and read it later to glimpse that peak that others have striven for. And if you're the one writing, then in a way, that's your human spirit also striving for that same ultimate reality.
That's awesome. I want to insert in there too, though. We can't talk about poetry without talking about Emily Dickinson.
We can't. Sure.
And she has a vastly different style than I think most of the poets we've talked about. She has such a different style of her poetry, but it's still in its own way beautiful. She doesn't write these like long, lengthy sonnets or epics. Some of her poems are just maybe 3 short lines and snippets with like little breaks at the end. But they have their own way of expressing just a beautiful thought, a beautiful feeling, or even maybe a little bit of a longer. I forget the one about the frog.
I am nobody. Are you nobody too? And
Right.
There's a pair of us. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
That's
just
brilliant, yeah.
such a. It's fun, but it evokes feelings in a different way than I think manly poems, which can also evoke feelings, but in a different sense than Emily Dickinson does in just her short little tidbits.
Yeah, definitely. And that's I guess part of the genius of the nature of poetry. It's just it has the ability when it's used well to do that. You could look at frogs all day long and say there's you could do a philosophical meditation on the nature of loneliness and community, or you could say like that. It's like without saying it, it gets you to think it.
Right.
That is beautiful. That poetry can do that.
So having considered all these poets, great poets, stood the test of time, I think it's time to see how you yourself compare. So would you mind reading for us some of your own poetry?
Sure, I would. By which I mean no, I would not mind. So yes, I will.
And remember, to compare is to despair, so we're not judging you.
Right, of course.
Don't worry.
Right.
Again,
That's the audience this time.
like the same way I put myself in the category of like I'm just a seminarian who likes Chesterton.
Right.
Now I'm putting myself in the category of like, yes, I recognize that I'm trying to be like the greats, and I'm just categorically not. So one of the greats. Anyway, yeah. Let me pull up my iPhone. We're talking about all these like great works of history, and before iPhones were. But, yeah.
Well, that reminds me of just side topic while you do that. Emily Dickinson would just scratch her poems on like little slips of paper and then stuff them in a desk somewhere. So I just imagine her being like, "Oh, yeah, I have a poem, and I want to like." She just had to scramble through her desk and
Yeah. As I read my poem off my iPhone, just remember that William Shakespeare would read a play or watch a play and like have the entire thing memorized.
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So this might be like just one small indication of how far our memories and attention spans have deteriorated from the times of William Shakespeare.
No doubt.
But, anyway. All right. So I'm going to read a poem that I think is appropriate for, actually just the time of year we're in. It was about a year ago that I wrote it, or that I sort of conceived it in my mind. And it has to do kind of with autumn, with this, this time of year and nature, back to nature. So that said, here is one of my poems, and I call it Frozen Things. How pretty are these autumn nights, with whistling winds and twinkling lights, and speckled, wind-tossed leaves in flight, all making me remember how on a bitter night like this I sat in peaceful, silent bliss, with only the fire's merry hiss, red with burning ember, and mused in thoughtful wanderings how wonderful this world, which brings a wintry warmth in frozen things, and joy in cold November, of ruddy glows and frozen toes, and frosted farmland in the snows, and firelight and warm windows, recalling to each member of hamlet far and household near, where loved ones dwell with loved ones dear, the love of him who comes each year at Christmas in December. There you go.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. It made me like feel temperature reading that. Like that was a really
awesome.
good use of different phrases and just setting the scene, the atmosphere that really like put it into your mind well. Yeah.
Sure, thank you.
And to your point, I think that would have lost, there's a little bit of alliteration that we would have lost had you not read it aloud, if we just texted to us.
Right? Yeah, right. True, actually, there's something about poetry that you like need to hear it said. You need to say it and you need to hear it said. But yeah, I don't know why or how. Cold things being warm, because we go into winter months and we're like, oh, it's cold. But there's so much warmth of like human feeling that goes in winter months also. You don't want to lose. So.
Right.
Mm-hmm. On that note, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I think
thank you for having me.
we're just about out of time.
Sweet.
We'll have to have you on another time and maybe another poem.
Sure, absolutely. Just feel free to ask. I'll be locked up in my poem room with my my thinking cap on. No, I'm kidding.
All right.
Alrighty, guys. Well, thanks so much.
Sure, farewell. To our listeners, remember, wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there's always laughter and good red wine. At least I've always found it so. Benedictimus Domino.